This conversation is super fascinating. I've been thinking about this one a lot. Johannes Bryson's view is so good, and I can imagine a lot of people being worked up because of the slave language. But I think she's making a really good point that why would you make your paperclip maximizer conscious and sentient? I hear some AI theorists saying, because if you don't, then it's this black box, literally like blackness inside. It is a philosophical zombie that just performs its task. If it's a automated weapon, autonomous weapon, then it might be better to be conscious and give it feelings so that at least it might withhold the strike or something like that. So I see both views, and it's really tough to consider like what's best. I do think if you were going to make a conscious tool, a conscious machine that is for a task, you should make it with desires to do that task. Because if you make it like us, if it's artificial generally intelligent like us, I don't want to just make paper clips the rest of my life. I don't want to just do TPS reports or something. But if you made a AI that loves doing that, then you give it work to do and it's like, yes, this is awesome. But I think it's still probably best to just not give them consciousness if we can avoid that. Hey, welcome back to another episode of Parker's Pensées. I'm your host, Parker Sedecase, and this is a podcast where we explore all the deepest ideas in philosophy, theology, nature, and life. I love thinking about cool stuff, so come think with me. Today's episode is very, very special. I have with me Dr. Sven Hyholm, and we're going to be talking about his book, This is Technology Ethics. It's a really, really good book. I think it's super timely. There's a whole series of This Is, and then a bunch of, different titles. This one, I don't know the rest of the series, but I do know this one, and it's very, very good. I'm excited to jump into machine ethics, technology ethics. What is technology? We're going to go a little bit onto Heidegger. Sorry to all my analytic folks, but it's important in the philosophy of technology to talk about Heidegger. We're going to go in on AI, super intelligent AI. We're going to go all over the place. This is going to be great. So stay tuned. Make sure you watch the full thing. If you guys like this podcast, please consider supporting me on Patreon. I'd love to do this full time. I'd love to just be churning out episodes for you guys, doing research all the time. So if you like this stuff, help support it. Help me feed my puppies. You can also support it if you're watching this on YouTube by becoming a YouTube member. And check the description for a bunch of other ways to support the podcast. Thank you guys. I really appreciate that. All right. So enough commodifying myself. Let's talk about commodifying robots and whether or not they should be servants or slaves or what. Sven, thanks so much for coming on the podcast.
Well, thank you. Thanks for inviting me.
Yeah, like I said, I really appreciate this book. It's fantastic. So thanks for sending it to me. Before we jump into some of the details of the book, you're a professor of the ethics of artificial intelligence. How'd that come about? How'd you get interested in philosophy, and then how'd you end up becoming so specialized into AI ethics?
Well, I mean, I started with sort of regular philosophy, so to speak, and I did a PhD at the University of Michigan, and then I did a postdoc, and then my second job was at the Technical University of Eindhoven in the Netherlands. And so when I started working there, I thought, well, this is a technical university, so I should, start working on stuff to do with technology. I had already done that a little bit before, so there's a discussion in philosophy about human enhancement, using technology to enhance ourselves. So I was a little bit into that stuff already, but especially when I went to Eindhoven to work at the Technical University there, I really got into sort of AI and technology, and self-driving cars was really a hype at that point in time. And
yeah,
so yeah,
that's awesome. What kind of things are you most interested in about AI? Is it like the ontology, or is it how humans treat them? A little bit of both.
Well, yeah, a little bit of both. I mean, I think actually the very idea of AI is already interesting. I mean, like from the very beginning, it's the idea has been that we create AI when we create technologies that can even perform or sort of take over tasks that we use our human intelligence to perform.
Mm-hmm.
And so, and usually when we have to use our intelligence to perform something, that means that it's an important task for which we are morally responsible. I mean, take, for example, driving cars. That's a big responsibility. You have to exercise care so that you careful with the other people on the road, etc. And so if we start giving over tasks like that for which we are responsible to technologies that are not necessarily responsible agents, then we might get gaps in responsibility. We might get back to that later. But so this whole idea of technologies doing human-like things, I mean, of course, these days the big hype is not around self-driving cars as much anymore as it is around sort of large language models.
Yeah.
And so, I mean, going back in the history of philosophy, Cicero used to say that, our ability to speak and produce text makes us sort of almost divine. And
Mm.
now we have technologies that produce text and speak, so to speak. Are they divine too, or should we abandon this idea that there's something special about talking and speaking and thinking? So anyway, those kinds of questions really drew me in, and so that's what led me down the path of the sort of the ethics of AI.
That's awesome. Yeah, that stuff is very, very fascinating. You hit on so many things I want to just jump on right away. But I did promise people, much to some's chagrin, that we're going to talk about Heidegger. Um, I'm in the analytic school of philosophy. I mess around with some continental stuff. I mess around with some phenomenology, all sorts of stuff. But I know that many of my analytic friends really do not like Heidegger. Why is Heidegger so prominent in the philosophy of technology and tech ethics type stuff?
Yeah, so my book starts with Heidegger, and I never thought I would start a book with Heidegger because previously I'd never written anything about Heidegger. But as you said, in the debate about the ethics of technology, Heidegger is a very prominent figure. Part of the reason is that actually most of his writings are really hard to understand and very complicated and esoteric, etc. But he wrote one paper called The Question of Technology, or The Question Concerning Technology, the different translations. That's actually perhaps like the easiest Heidegger read if you want to sort of try reading
Yeah.
a little bit of Heidegger. I mean, the first half of the essay is pretty easy, and then it gets more and more difficult. But so I talk mostly about the first part of the essay in my book. And basically, what Heidegger says is that, well, okay, so what is technology really? And then he says, well, actually, I think we all agree that technology is a tool, a means to an end, and it's a human practice.
Mhm.
And he says we can call that the instrumental and anthropological theory of technology. So anthropology is concerned with human practices or human activities. And so if you put your sort of anthropologist hat on, you would think of technologies in terms of human practices, human activities. If you put your sort of engineering hat on, you think of creating tools. And what kind of problems do we have? What kind of tools can we design to solve our problems? And then technology is sort of the thing that you use as a tool to solve a problem. Now, he then goes on, I mean, Heidegger, to say that, well, that's not everything that technology is. It also makes us perceive the world in certain ways. And so if you
Mhm.
have created tools by which you can exploit nature in certain ways, for example, then what was previously maybe perceived as a beautiful river now is maybe seen as a source of electricity or energy because you can put up as a water plant and power plant and start using it as a means to an end all of a sudden. So technologies can change how we perceive things, and they will also bring our attention to different aspects of the world. And so there's a lot of much more complicated stuff in that essay, but some of those insights have been seen as really interesting, partly because it highlights that depending on whether you think about technology as an anthropologist, as an engineer, or perhaps as a philosopher, an ethicist, you're going to sort of think of technology in different ways, and different aspects of technology are going to be what's sort of salient to you.
Yeah.
And also, people are going to disagree. So, I mean, if you ask an economist what technology is, they might talk about, what supply and demand, or willingness to work, and whatever things that economists are interested in. The engineer will talk about tools for solving problems, and
Mm.
the philosopher will talk about other things. And so, I think that's one of the useful things about the essay, that it sort of highlights that depending on what glasses you have on, or a hat you have on, so to speak, how you think about technology is going to be different.
Yeah. No, I think that's totally right. And when I read that essay last year for my philosophy of technology class, I went in with this like really hardcore bias against Heidegger, but I did find myself being really helped by his conversation concerning technology and the seeing as component there, where you look and you see things like standing in reserve, and he's got all these phrases for what you're doing. But you look at a forest, and if you own a logging company, then you see dollar signs, or you see this many pencils coming from that or something, and you don't necessarily see the trees anymore. And there's like you've acquired a new concept, or you're seeing it as something else. And I thought that was a really cool point that you mentioned in your conversation about post phenomenologists like Bruno Latour. And you're like, well, a lot of this is actually still in Heidegger's original essay. So even though some folks trying to move beyond Heidegger he may have already been there, which I thought was really fascinating.
Absolutely. I mean, I should say just one more thing about Heidegger. I mean, he's also discussed because in this context, because he had a sort of bias towards traditional technologies
Yeah.
and a kind of aversion to modern technology.
Hmm.
And so he would go and spend time in a little cabin in the woods where
Little
he would
hut.
sort of live the simple life. He would put on sort of traditional clothing, and when he would sit there and write philosophy books and essays, and so that's also something that people often talk about. And so this distinction between sort of technologies that are new and that are sort of upsetting our way of life, so to speak. Sometimes people talk about disruptive technology, and definitely Heidegger. I mean, he's not against technology as such because he likes, a water well or like,
Yeah.
this old kinds of technologies, but he doesn't like modern technology. And in a certain sense, that's also something that people tend to discuss. And so it represents a kind of conservatism about technology development. Let's take it very slowly,
Hmm.
carefully. Let's not just throw technology out in society in the way that, for example, we do today with AI. And
Yeah.
I already mentioned large language models. I mean,
Right.
OpenAI dumped ChatGPT out into society and said, "You go and play with it, and let's see what happens." I
Right.
think Heidegger would say that, okay, that's maybe too abrupt. Let's tread more carefully.
Yeah. Yeah. So something there's something like romantic in the fact that Heidegger went out into a cabin, he called it the hut, and would philosophize about philosophy. I David Chalmers has come up with this new term, techno philosopher, and I want to think of myself as like a Luddite techno philosopher. I want to dress in like a 19 or 1890s garb, and then dream about AI and stuff like that. There's something about that that just gets me. I love that. So it's kind of fascinating that Heidegger did that. You do broach the topic that, like, hey, look, he was part of the Nazi party, and I want to address that for folks. Like, look, you don't have to like Heidegger, but if you want to study tech philosophy, this paper, The Question Concerning Technology, is very, very important. So that's for the audience. You guys deal with that. I also wanted to talk about tech determinism versus like techno optimism. I think that Heidegger was probably a tech a tech determinist. I'll say that. Is that Do you use that language? Do you like those concepts or not really?
Yeah, well, yes and no.
Okay.
I think that society is very techno-deterministic. We sort of think that technology has a certain path that is following and that we can't do anything about it.
Yeah.
And actually, sometimes technology ethics, which is the subject of the book, is represented as trying to stop technology development, and that
Mm.
there's a certain development that is inevitable, and then technology ethicists such as myself, we're trying to slow down the development. I'm a little bit like Heidegger. People might associate that with Heidegger to some extent, and there's also a medical ethics model. People in bioethics traditionally have been sometimes coming from kind of theology point of view and being against abortion and things like that. And that's the kind of the model that sometimes is used when people think about what technology is or could be. And I think there are two problems with that. I mean, one is that technology could develop in different directions. It's not as if there's only one path it could take, and then the question is just, should it go slow or should it be a fast development? I think it can develop in different directions. And second, I think technology ethics should not only be about slowing things down, but also kind of steering things in the right direction.
Mm.
Zooming out and looking at the bigger context, at what role would we like technology to play in our lives? Heidegger, this idea of being out in nature and so on. I mean, there's something to that, and that's
Yeah.
there's certain experiences that you can't really have in the same way. Well, so far, of course, you mentioned David Chalmers, and of course, in the metaverse in the future, perhaps we can have something that, from the
Right.
inside, so to speak, is hard to distinguish from a real experience in nature. But we're clearly not there yet.
Right.
And also, yeah. So that's and anyway. So the main point being that we shouldn't think of technological development as a kind of deterministic thing that goes towards a certain telos or a certain end. It
Okay.
could go in different directions. Technology ethics should be there to kind of steer the right direction. And it's not only about what's bad about technology, but also what potentially could be really good, could be
Hmm.
useful, what we want more of, and perhaps also thinking about what we want less of, so to speak. So
Yeah. No, that's really helpful. in that conversation between the tech optimists and tech determinists comes this idea that either technology is value neutral or value laden, and usually the determinists think it's value laden in a negative way, that it's inframing us, and it's to use Heideggerian language, it's turning us into a certain type of thing, and we can't avoid it, and it's usually negative. And I was wondering if that comes up in the debate between the instrumentalists and the anthropologists. I assume that, or I don't assume, I know that the tech instrumentalists think that it's value neutral. It's just a tool, and humans use it for different reasons. I'm not sure about the tech anthropology view. Is that more deterministic? Is that value laden, or do they not take a stand on that?
Yeah, I mean, I mentioned that I used to work at a technical universities teaching engineers, and so if you would ask them about technology, they would always say it's a tool, it's value neutral in itself. We project value onto technology, we use it for our ends, and that's where the value lies. Since then, I've moved to different universities. I now teach people who come more from philosophy and other places at the University of Munich. And yeah, that's definitely the case that depending on what kind of students you have, depending on whether you're talking with philosophers, with anthropologists, with sociologists, whether or not technology is seen as value neutral is going to be a discussion you will have with some people, and they will deny that it has any value. Inherently, and they say that it's a tool, and tools are, we give them their functions, and we use them. Maybe we are bad people, maybe we are good people, and that's what determines whether they get positive or negative value. Now, other people, as you said, especially people who take sort of an anthropological point of view, they argue, and here we get to some of the people that you mentioned, like Latour and the Dutch philosopher Peter Paul Fabriek, etc. They argue that our values are somehow embedded in the technologies we use, and that could even be the case for technologies that are sort of tools. So think about a bridge. It sort of embodies the human desire to get from where the bridge starts to where the bridge ends, so to speak.
Yeah.
And the whole idea of the bridge is that there's a value in being able to, cross from one side of this, from one shore to the other, whatever it might be, that the bridge is. And so, I mean, that's clearly mostly a tool. On the other hand, most bridges have also been designed to look a certain way. If you look at bridges in different periods of time, they also embody different aesthetic ideals. And so, like, I mean, maybe some older bridges are sometimes more beautiful to some people. I mean, definitely Heidegger would say it used to be much nicer before. Now it's all about function, and there's a lack of beauty. And some people like sort of brutalist modern architecture, etc. So there are also the aesthetic dimensions. But when you get to technology such as AI and other more advanced modern technologies, especially the technology that is trained on sort of data produced by humans. Well, I mean, let's take the language models again. Of course, if you train a language model on text produced by humans, and human language is filled with values, biases, and all sorts of things, that's going to be reproduced in the technology, and the technology is going to speak as if it values certain things, and well, speak, I mean, produce text that seems to, fit with certain values, maybe clash with others, and so that's it's one of the big discussions about whether values are somehow projected into technologies after the fact, or whether they are somehow already embodied in the technologies, and that can be by design, because maybe you think that, okay, I want to create a technology that's nice to look at, that is functional, and that doesn't discriminate against people with certain disabilities, etc. So there could be a lot of values that you're already thinking about at the design stage. On the other hand, there could also be lots of values that you're not thinking about, but that you somehow there are certain standards that are built into the technologies and that you only discover afterwards. I mean, if, for example, cars tend to be designed by males, and therefore, the seats may be, fit for a certain body type in terms of how tall you are, etc. And so, I mean, lots of technologies are like this. They tend to reflect the properties, the values, the prejudices, etc., of the people creating the technologies. Sometimes this happens even if the person doing that might not want to do it, and they might even think about not doing this. But still, I mean, it's very hard not to create things that would sort of reflect where we're coming from, so to speak.
Right. Yeah, yeah, I've experienced this when it comes to headphones. So I'm wearing these guys because I have cauliflower ear from wrestling my whole life, and I can't use the little earbud things.
Mm.
And I never thought about it until you said that, where like there is a value there, and they're prejudicing against cauliflower ear folks. Just kidding, folks. That's not that big a deal. But I understand what you're saying. That's really fascinating. And I wonder, whenever there's two extremes or two contrary views, it's really nice to be able to be like, well, I'm somewhere in the middle of these two. And I'm sure there's probably something like that. But thinking about like my Sony camera that I'm recording on right now, there are some values laden in it. It's meant more for content creators, so it's smaller and it's more, sleek and versatile. But those values seem different than what would be intrinsic or incorporated into a large language model that's been trained on the internet and has human in the loop. That's been, a reinforcement learning with a human in the loop who's correcting and helping shape. It seems like that would be inherently more uh, laden with value and biases than like just the development of a Sony camera. Is that a naive view? Maybe like I can imagine someone being like, "That's really silly." They're both obviously value laden.
Yeah, well, I mean, I think they may differ with respect to how intentional the value ladenness is, so to speak. I mean, so
Mm,
whoever designed the Sony camera, I mean, probably was not one person, but the
right.
team, and they were looking at previous cameras, etc. They were probably thinking a lot about how to sort of optimize the camera, along different dimensions. It shouldn't cost too much. It should work very well. It should do this. It should do that. And so they really thought about all of these things. Whereas the more you use data that comes from some place where people didn't think about the fact that what they were saying or typing or
Oh,
whatever, it's going to put
right.
in there. You're going to
Yeah.
get much more room for unintentional biases or values and things like that being. Oops, sorry, just my the screensaver was.
Okay.
I'm back.
Sounds good. Yeah. Um, I didn't miss you at all. So,
Okay,
yeah,
I
yeah,
was just going to say, so depending on how much thought has been put into the design, uh, uh, the more designed the values are, so to speak, the more planned out they are, and the more you use data and other inputs that people didn't think about the fact that this was going to go in a language model or this was going to go in some other kind of generative AI, let's say, the more there's a risk that you put all sorts of garbage in there that you didn't want, and that
yeah.
there's going to be garbage in and garbage out. So as the
That's right.
expression goes.
Yeah, that's such a fascinating point because I've asked like ChatGPT 3 or 3.5 certain questions that are very specific to my research project about Donald Davidson's triangulation argument, and it's like very very specific. There's not a whole bunch of people working on it, and I've asked them, and it's thrown back some stuff that sounds a lot like me, and I'm like, well, I wonder if some of that is from my earlier blog posts on this stuff, like a few
Quite
years
possible.
back. Yeah, and it's really fascinating. It's really surprising, and then once you think about it, and I wonder about like the ethics of, that pastiche model of LLMs that they're grabbing and it's not really thinking, right? Well, I don't think it's thinking. I think it's pastiching things together. And I wonder about the ethics of like the plagiarism at play there. I didn't write this stuff with ChatGPT in mind. Like you said, I didn't write this to optimize like the best thing to say if this is picked up by a large language model and spit back out at me. What I guess since I put it on the internet, it's like fair game. But I wonder, has there been any work on like plagiarism and LLMs?
Well, I mean, there is work that's ongoing, and I mean, I've been looking at sort of the ethics and philosophy of large language models, and of course, academic peer review is slow, and so
Hmm.
I know several colleagues who are working on these kinds of topics, and some things are starting to come out, but I'm assuming that if we just give it a few months, they're going to be
Yeah.
even much more than there already is, and so definitely there are people working on it, and I mean, there are also, for example, artists that have complained that some of this sort of AI generated art seems to be using their work, so to speak, and they're
Yeah.
not getting credit. and definitely the kind of situation that you were talking about, that maybe if not a lot of people have written about a certain topic, then quite likely they're, if that data was part of the training data, they're going to have a big influence on the outputs on that topic. Yeah, I mean, as I said, there haven't been super many peer-reviewed publications on this yet, but people are definitely talking about it. And one topic that comes up is that there's a difference between plagiarism of the the normal old sort, so to speak, and
Mm.
plagiarism of this new kind, because there's not a particular source that's the one that you're copying.
Mm.
Uh, and so if plagiarism means that you go, like, let's say that you've written a blog post and I go and take your text and then I put it into my paper, and then I don't say that this is a quote, and I don't say that I've reformulated something you do, I present it as my own writing, then I've sort of directly stolen your text, so to speak.
Mhm.
But that's not exactly what happens with if you have some large language model trained on a lot of text data, and it's some sort of compromise between people's text inputs. So that you're not copying any particular person. I mean, the more we have a situation like the one that you described, where perhaps a certain topic has only been written about by some people, and maybe you plagiarize in that small group of authors that have written
Mm.
about
Yeah.
Davidson's the theory of X or Y, whatever it might be.
Yeah.
But the more people are involved, in a certain sense, the less it becomes like plagiarism, and the more it becomes like, not thinking by yourself, but just trying to see what's in the air and just writing something down, so to speak. So it's definitely different from plagiarism of the normal old sort, but it's still maybe possibly a kind of cheating. I mean,
Yeah.
like I mean, I actually we spoke about Heidegger before, and when I played around with ChatGPT, I put in the question, what would Heidegger say about AI ethics?
Mm.
Now, actually, ChatGPT produced a pretty good short little essay on this topic. Now,
Yeah.
if I were a student in a class and that was the topic of the course, I mean, which it might be in an AI ethics course, and I handed this in, and I said, I've written this. I mean, I've cheated in a certain sense because I haven't written it. That would be
Yeah.
a false statement. I mean, if I were to say, I put in the prompt, what would Heidegger say about AI ethics into ChatGPT, and here's what the result was, and I handed that in and I explained this. Well, I mean, then the teacher might say, okay, you didn't plagiarize. Technically speaking, you maybe didn't even cheat because you said what you did. But on the other hand, we don't know whether this reflects any understanding that you might have of
Mm.
Heidegger, any effort that you put in. You haven't showed any particular talent, so to speak. So you're not living up to the academic standards that would maybe earn you a good grade, at least on this particular task,
Right.
unless the task was just play around with ChatGPT and see what kind of philosophy papers you can do. Sure,
Yeah.
then you might have done well. But on the normal kind of things that we're testing when we ask students to write essays, well, I as a student wouldn't have done very well on this task. But is it plagiarism? Not well, not at least not in the same way as if you had written a paper on this topic and I copied and pasted and then maybe just rewrote it a little bit and pretended I had written it. So
Yeah.
it's something else. And there are different ways of going here. You could stretch out the meaning of plagiarism so that it
Mm.
now also means using ChatGPT. Or you could say, actually, it's not plagiarism, it's something else. It may still be bad, it might be good in certain ways and in certain cases, but it's a new kind of problem that teachers grading essays or journals, publishing papers have to think about. And I don't know if plagiarism is the right category. And I think that's part of what the discussion has been about so far.
Yeah.
Is it the right category? Do we need new concepts to talk and think about the
Yeah.
kinds of things people are doing here?
Yeah, that's so fascinating. Imagine, you work at OpenAI and you've created something so powerful and different that it requires a new understanding of concepts like plagiarism. Like that's pretty fascinating. I think part of me is excited because I'm like, oh, something that I've look and maybe I'm just totally over evaluating my role in the Davidsonian prompt or whatever. But even if even if it is pulling from me, it's kind of cool because it's like, oh, something I did is actually, if anyone else asks this question, which probably no one else will, but if they do, then some of my work's out in the world. And the other side, it's like, well, it would also be nice to get some attribution and get some views on my page as well. So I wonder if there's, I'm sure they could do this where they reference the different sources that they've used, but maybe since it's trained on the internet with human in the loop reinforced learning, that maybe that's not actually feasible to cite where this stuff's coming from. Maybe it's just all up in there, and I don't know. What do you think about that?
Yeah, I don't know if it's possible to have it cite the exact text it got. I mean, it could maybe be connected with some sort of internet search function that could go and look for the
Yeah.
sources. That could be possible. But because I know that at least with ChatGPT, if you ask it to give sources, it would sometimes sort of hallucinate up sources that sound like they're possible.
Right.
And I mean, that could be maybe because people have used the wrong sources in some text from on the internet that
Oh,
is
yeah.
but it's not. I mean, it's not optimized to get the sources right. It's trying to just predict what people are likely what's likely to be the next word or string of words, and
Right.
that the way it works is not. I mean, it's not tracking authorship, so to speak. And
Yeah.
I mean, you could imagine, as you said, like future versions that maybe could actually cite where it got the text. But on the other hand, if it's using a lot of text to make predictions about how a new piece of text would continue, then maybe in a certain sense it's not even possible to say what's the. It could
Right.
just say, well, it's from Reddit or Wikipedia, but that's not very useful.
Right. Yeah. We need someone to make a site GPT for us to add on top of this. Um, so I guess I wasn't careful and I sucked you down a rabbit hole too fast. What do you think technology is? Do you side more with the instrumentalists or the anthropologists or the determinists? Like, do you have a particular view that you find yourself in?
Well, I mean, so in general, I tend to like sort of pluralistic views of things, and
Sure.
so what I do in the book is I start with the instrumentalist view. Technology is always just a tool, a value neutral tool. The anthropological view, well, it's part of human activity, human life, etc. It plays a key role in different cultures, etc. And then I say, well, look, actually, these days there are people who say that technologies can be much more. Some technologies can be moral agents. They can be decision makers. The self-driving car might need to make a decision whether to go left or right, and depending on what it does, it might harm one or four or five people. On different, it's like a trolley dilemma type situation. People
Yeah.
discuss it very much and say, even though real life might not be like that, nevertheless, self-driving cars are going to have to make a lot of and other technologies as well are going to have to make morally sensitive decisions, and so they're going to have to be more than mere tools. They're going to have to be decision makers as well.
Yeah.
Others say, such as Blake Lemoine, to use the language model example again. I mean, he was the Google engineer who did an interview with Washington Post in June, I think it was, of 2022, where he said that actually the large language models that I've been testing in my role at Google has become a person.
Mm.
It has acquired emergent properties and abilities, sentience, and we should now start treating this technology not as a mere tool, but also as a person, as not just as an agent, because he thought it was an agent too, but also as a patient, as a
Yeah.
moral patient, as an entity or a person against whom you could act wrongly, or against in relation to whom you can also act in a virtuous and good way.
Hmm.
And so it's interesting to see that from on the one extreme you have it's a value neutral tool, on the other extreme you have this view that no, technologies can be agents acting in the world. They can be patients against in relation to whom we can act in an unethical or ethically good way. And so, although I'm somewhat skeptical about the idea of many technologies as moral patients, it's at least interesting to know that not only philosophers philosophize about this, but also people such as Blake Lemoine,
Yeah.
former Google engineer, because he was ultimately fired, but someone who working in tech like that. I mean, he's not the only one. I mean, there was someone else just a few weeks or months earlier who had tweeted. I can't remember the name at the moment. Something like, some of our large language models are slightly conscious, perhaps was the
Yeah.
quote. And
There's
yeah, so
sparks of consciousness, someone said too.
did.
Yeah.
And now there's a recent paper by a team of researchers at Microsoft to say that there are sparks of general intelligence in
There we go. Yeah. Yeah.
GPT-4. And they say that GPT-4 is not yet generally intelligent, but there are the sparks or the beginnings of general intelligence. And presumably that's also saying that technology is more than a means to an end or a tool. It's starting to acquire new properties that are unlike what you would find in a frying pan or a hammer, which
Yeah.
are tools that have no intelligence, that have no capacities. in themselves, but rather they have certain affordances. They make it possible for us to do certain things.
Yeah.
Whereas now we have technologies, according to Microsoft or their researchers, that have abilities on their own to kind of come up with new initiatives or solve problems in novel ways, and so on and so forth.
Yeah. This is so good. This is good. I'm so glad you brought up Lemoyne and the patient versus agent. Can you break that down for the listeners? What's the difference between a moral patient and a moral agent? And do they come apart? Can something be a moral patient without being a moral agent itself?
Yeah, so a lot of people think that children, not children, babies, let's say,
Okay.
are moral patients and maybe even par excellence. I mean, people tend to say that it's wrong to torture an innocent baby. Like philosophers sometimes say, like, if anything is obvious, that's a moral truth. Like people
Right.
sometimes defend moral realism by saying that that's such an obvious fact. The same people would probably not say that those babies are moral agents who can make moral decisions
Mhm.
because they're not yet mature enough. They are maybe potential moral agents, and one day, if everything goes well, they will develop into moral agents.
Mhm.
And what does that mean? We can already act rightly or wrongly in relation to babies. You can treat them well or treat them in bad ways, but they themselves cannot act in ethically significant ways. So they can't make moral decisions. They can't reflect on ethics. And so the moral agent would be an entity or a being or a human typically, but perhaps also an AI system or maybe some higher animals like maybe chimpanzees, who knows, that could think about ethics and make decisions, guided by views about what would be right and wrong to do, and to be sensitive in their decision making to morally relevant properties. That would be the moral agent.
Okay.
The moral patient would be anything such that you can act rightly or wrongly so that you can harm them or benefit them. Some people say that, well, actually, maybe the natural environment is a moral patient.
Yeah.
You can harm the environment in a morally significant way. There's something unethical about wrecking the environment. Some people think, and so climate change is, if insofar as it's ruining the natural environment, is somehow unethical, not only to future generations of people living now who might be harmed, but perhaps even to nature itself. That's
Yeah.
one view that some people
Gaia.
take.
Hmm.
Much more commonly, though, is it to say that you have to be able to feel, or to maybe to have a will that can be respected or not respected. And so I think I mentioned Cicero before, and this idea that talking makes human beings divine.
Yeah.
Uh, that's according to someone like Cicero, what gives us our special, what he calls human dignity. And obviously, there's a tradition of saying that what's special about humans is that we have a special kind of human dignity.
Hmm.
In that tradition of thinking, it's the more rational part of our nature that gives us this special status. Of course, someone like Jeremy Bentham seems to have been responding partly to Cicero when he said that, ask not, can they talk, can they reason, but when you look around at other beings, ask, can they suffer?
Yeah.
And obviously, Cicero also thought that animals could suffer, but he thought that they couldn't think and talk. And so, therefore, there was a deep moral distinction between humans and animals,
Yeah.
which then Bentham denies. I mean, interestingly, if you go with the Cicero line of thought, perhaps you might say that, well, machines can't feel, but some of them can talk in a way. And so
Oh,
they
yeah.
might have a kind of moral status having to do with that.
That's so fascinating. Yeah, I hadn't considered doing a runaround through the Ciceroian view on language. That's so fascinating. I I wonder. So going with the feeling suffering thing. Sometimes people will go. Sometimes people will say because animals don't have or may not have like reflective abilities, second order thoughts or something. They don't suffer. They feel pain, but they don't like ruminate on that pain, so they don't suffer. And that's kind of, I don't know. I think that's kind of a weird view. But are m- are moral facts? So I don't want to commit you to like moral realism, but are whatever moral facts are, moral truths or moral dignity, moral status, do you think that's grounded in like consciousness? Is it grounded in phenomenal consciousness or consciousness simpliciter or the ability to be conscious? I guess that would be more of Jeremy Bentham's view. Do you think that's true?
Well, I mean, I think one should distinguish between the question of whether moral facts are grounded in facts about consciousness on the one
Mm,
hand, and whether specific moral facts about who counts morally speaking is always going to be dependent on what entities are conscious. And so you could have some sort of I don't know, social constructivist kind of view of morality, where morality is the result of agreements and social practices. But those social practices could sort of agree on the fact that we should treat suffering as one of the most important ethical properties.
Yeah.
Or you could just think that, I mean, if you're a kind of divine command theorist, you might think that the divine being has said, these are the moral facts, and then that same divine being said, okay, the most important thing is to promote happiness and avoid, suffering. Actually, I think there are some early Christian utilitarians whose names I'm forgetting at the moment, but that were writing a little bit around the same time as Bentham, who really had that kind of view that ethics is, comes from God, and God is utilitarian. Bentham himself did take that view that you were suggesting, that it's both the content and the source of sort of moral facts. I mean, the fact that we're suffering and that animals are suffering and also are capable of happiness or pleasant feelings as well. So that would be a view that would both ground moral facts in facts about suffering, and I would say that the content of these moral facts have to do with promoting the one, happiness, and trying to prevent the others suffering.
Yeah. Okay. That's really fascinating, because I'm trying to get to I'm thinking more and more about like robot rights and animal rights, and the distinction that some folks make between like moral concern and moral rights, or moral status. Um, do you So with the infant's case, it looks like they are moral patients, and yet they're not moral agents, but they have like we give them human rights, or we recognize that they have human rights. So it looks like you don't have to be a moral agent to have human rights, but you could just be like a moral patient and have human rights. Does that follow, or is it because it's an infant is of the species human that they have human rights?
Yeah, well, I mean, obviously that's a quite a big discussion. That's it goes back before the philosophy of technology. But one view that people sometimes take is that they're not yet moral agents, but they are sort of moral agents in training, if you will, and this is part of what gives them an additional sort of moral status over and above the moral status that has to do with the fact that they can maybe suffer and that they can feel pleasure and pain. I mean, someone like Peter Singer would say that if you did have an infant where there would be no chance of it developing sort of an adult's mental life, so to speak, then that infant would maybe have the same moral status as some animal that would stay at the same level. Most people would find that quite counterintuitive and disagree with it, and perhaps they would say what you just said before, that well, maybe even such an infant belongs to the species of humans that are able to become moral agents, and then they somehow, because of their membership in the group of rational beings, so to speak,
Yeah.
even if they will not develop those capacities, still should be treated in the same way. Uh, I mean, there are obviously lots of different views about this. Now, one view, to just maybe take this back to the technology and robot rights, etc., topic that's out there, is that, well, I mean, if you had some technology that, even though it couldn't suffer and it couldn't feel happiness, etc., behaved as if it did,
Right.
and maybe consistently, and it didn't just do that, it also behaved like human beings more generally. So it could engage in conversation, it could react in the right sorts of ways. What right means, how would a human normally react in the right sort of circumstances, etc. Then, even though it might be a kind of zombie, so to speak, because there's nothing on the inside, it could still be a member of the moral community, because it could sort of outwardly perform as if it were a feeling, thinking, suffering being, so to speak. And so
Yeah.
this is a view that's out there. I mean, I have a friend and colleague, John Danaher. He defends this view. He calls it ethical behaviorism. There are other researchers. I believe that David Gunkel was on your show. Is that right?
That's right. That's right. Yep.
Yeah. So I mean, you may have discussed this. I didn't yet watch the episode, but most likely you talked about what he calls the relational view of ethics. That ethics has a lot to do with what kind of relationships or what kind of interaction you have with things around you, and you don't have access, David says, and or John, to the inner thoughts. We have access to how people express their, or apparently express their, inner thoughts and how they behave. And if we did have technologies that did behave in the same way, they argue, then we can welcome them into the moral circle, the moral community, just as we would with a human being that behaved in that way. I
Right.
mean, I myself am a little bit of a skeptic when it comes to this kind of point of view, but
Yeah, me too.
the view that's out there, and those are highly respected colleagues, and
Yeah.
so
Yeah. Yeah, I'm with you on that, and I think they're super sharp, and I want to get Danaher on the program. For those listening who are into jujitsu, there's another John Danaher who studied philosophy, was doing a PhD, and then switched over into jujitsu. This is not the same John Danaher, Danaher, even though it's spelled exactly the same, and they're both philosophers. I would like to have both John Danahers on the podcast. So if you're
yeah,
listening,
same
come on,
show maybe.
that'd be amazing. Yeah, it'd be so good. Um, the relational theory and the ethical behaviorism, I had that in my notes here. I'm so glad you brought that up. That's what I was setting up the infant stuff, and I'm so glad you brought up infants as well. um it seems like in the infant case, we have more reason to think that they are conscious. There's always the problem of other minds, but you seem like you're of the same class or kind as me, that we're both humans. And so maybe I can do an analogy or an inference to the best explanation to say, like, I think that you have a consciousness like mine. um, but when it comes to like robots or machines or algorithms, seems like the burden of proof is more on them, because they don't fit the same natural kind as me, to say, like, here's an extra reason to think that they're conscious and that they ought to have rights. um I don't know. I can't get the behaviorism motivated for me, because it just seems like we could have like simulacra that just are totally. It seems like most simulacra would be uh uh philosophical zombies, right? That there wouldn't be something it's like to be them. Is there no other? I just don't get it. Can you maybe motivate the behaviorism for me? I really don't understand why, because it looks like it's being like us. It deserves rights.
Yeah, well, I mean, one thing one can do is also to contrast it. When we talked about Blake Lemoine before, and so one interesting difference between someone like Blake Lemoine and actually John Danaher, and not the jiu-jitsu guy, but
Yeah.
the other John Danaher, and also David Gunkel, is that so Blake Lemoine, he thought that Lambda, the language model, should have rights because it has an inner life, because it has
Yeah.
sentience, and so
Yeah.
he
Yeah.
thought it doesn't just behave as if it does. He has done a lot of interviews, and I would recommend that people go and check them out, because he's a very intelligent and clever guy with
Right.
unusual views, let's say. And he says that there are other language models that behave as if they have an inner life and sentience, but Lambda is different because it truly somehow has these emergent properties, and
Mhm.
that's why we should care for about a Lambda, treated with, or him or her, or it, so to speak, with
Yep.
moral consideration. So that's quite different. And it seems to me that in a certain sense, David and John would have to say that, well, Blake Lemoine is wrong. Like, if you have other language models that lack an inner life, then they too should be treated with moral consideration. And
Right.
there should not be any difference. And it seems to me that even though I don't agree with Blake Lemoine, I mean, he seems to have the right view, but the
Right.
wrong view about which entities have consciousness.
Totally.
I mean, we really care about consciousness in sort of everyday life. I mean, if you were a really good actor and you just consistently pretended to be my friend, and maybe I'm even paying you to do this, you could behave like my friend in all situations where a friend would behave in certain ways. Maybe you could do a better job than some of my actual friends. I would still think that there's a relevant difference, because you had the wrong attitude, so to
Right.
speak. You
Right.
you doing it because I'm paying you nicely, etc. And maybe you're thinking about other things, etc. Than the ones that friends would do in the situations. And so I think in that kind of case, we wouldn't think of you as a real friend, or you would be behaving as if you're one. In the same way, if you're an actor in a movie on a stage pretending to suffer, and you're doing this as a kind of like art installation that goes on your whole life, you
Mm. Yeah.
pretend to suffer some of the time. We maybe we couldn't know because you're such a good actor, but at least in theory, if we had a kind of God's eye view, there would be a difference between you and the person truly suffering.
Yeah.
And so it may be right. And this is one of the things that John and David say, that you can't know who's acting and who's real, and you can only go on the outside. And we should be fine with that, and therefore we should. I mean, whether or not the robots or the AI really have feelings and thoughts doesn't matter.
Mm.
because they have what people with feelings and thoughts do have, namely they have the right behaviors.
Yeah.
But still, that seems, in a certain sense, that it admits that there is at least a difference in philosophy, so to speak.
Right.
And like you said, I mean, babies, you and me, we're made of the same stuff, and then we have computers and large language models and robots and dolls or whatever it might be. They're made of other stuff, and so even if they had a kind of consciousness, a kind of subjective experience, there's no guarantee that it would have any similarity to the kinds that of experience and thoughts and feelings, etc., that humans or animals do, of the sorts that we think are morally relevant. And so, yeah, I
Yeah.
mean, I can't really make a good case for the view because I find it very implausible. But
Yeah.
again, I'm the wrong person to speak
That's
on
right.
their view,
Yeah.
and so
Yeah. I'll bring Gunkel back on
should
and
he's
Danaher.
a very articulate and intelligent guy, and
Totally.
he'll do a much better job at selling his view. Yeah,
Well, it's hard because I agree with you. I'm on board with you, and I think of for the folks at home who have a hard time maybe thinking about this acting thing. Think of like the Truman Show, and in the Truman Show, he was married to a woman who didn't love him, but it was her job to act their whole life, their whole lives, that act like she was in love with him when she wasn't. And then you go in for like just strengthen that a little bit for like Hillary Putnam super actors, and he's got super actors and super Spartans that are they can even control like their neurophysiology maybe, or they're so good at controlling their emotions that it doesn't show up that they're lying on their neurophysiology or something like that. And that's what AI would be, or could be. And so you don't know. Maybe you're creating these super actors. I think maybe the behaviorist folks, even if they don't consider themselves behaviorists, but focus in on behaviorism, maybe a nice way of putting their view is that they're saying, let's expand the boundaries of who we give rights to just in case. And if they are saying that, I can see that, because you wouldn't want to exclude someone from the moral realm. You wouldn't want to withhold moral status from something that does have moral status. And so I guess I do kind of see that view, but
yeah, but that's
yeah,
quite different though. That's sort of putting in precautions so that we don't
yeah,
accidentally fail to give more consideration to those who deserve it.
yeah,
Where or I mean, some people would say that that's also a risk because we might be using up resources, namely our
yeah,
concern, and that's a
yeah,
limited resource. I mean,
yeah, that's
one
true.
interesting view here in this context comes from Joanna Bryson.
Mhm.
And so she's an interesting person in this context because she thinks that it is quite possible to build robots and AI systems that would be moral agents and patients, but we shouldn't,
Yeah,
because we would create a dilemma for ourselves, because we are still going to own and buy and sell these technologies. Say they are going to be, I mean, in the terminology that she has since regretted using, they are going to be our slaves.
yeah,
And slavery is wrong. I mean, she and I hope most of the listeners agree. And so, therefore, we shouldn't create slaves. And so, even though it would be possible in theory, at least, I mean, she actually thinks that there might be a simple kind of consciousness in some technologies already.
mm,
Uh, we should avoid creating technologies that we would have duties towards, because they are still going to be owned and sold and used by us as tools.
yeah,
And so we should have a clear distinction between persons on the one hand and tools on the other hand.
yeah,
And it is possible to create tools that would be persons. And of course, it's also possible to treat persons as tools. I mean, there's the Kantian formula that you should avoid treating someone as a mere tool and
yeah,
always treat as a person, as an end at the same time.
yeah, yeah. This conversation's super fascinating. I've been thinking about this one a lot, and yeah, Johanna's Bryson's view is so good, and I can imagine a lot of people being worked up because of the slave language. But I think she's making a really good point that like, why would you make why would you make your paperclip maximizer conscious and sentient, like feeling? And I hear some AI theorists saying, well, because if you don't, then it's this black box and literally like blackness inside. It's a philosophical zombie that just performs its task. If it's a automated weapon, autonomous weapon, then like it might be better to be conscious and give it feelings, so that at least it might withhold the strike or something like that. So I see the both views, and it's really tough to consider like what's best. I do think if you were going to make a conscious tool, a conscious machine that is for a task, you should make it with desires to do that task. Because if you make it like us, if it's artificial generally intelligent like us, I don't want to just make paper clips the rest of my life. I don't want to just do TPS reports or something. But if you made a AI that loves doing that, then you give it work to do, and it's like, yes, this is awesome. But I think it's still probably best to just not give them consciousness if we can avoid that. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, it raises the so-called control problem
Yep.
related to AI. I mean, the more general the intelligence, as you say, I mean, there's no guarantee that there won't be emergent properties such as motivations to act in, well, to behave in different ways, or to try to carry out the assigned task that we have given to the technologies in new and creative ways that may potentially be dangerous for us. Because it might be that it's possible to create more paper clips, to use the example you mentioned, by removing humans from certain areas where there could be paper clips instead. So we might be
Right.
taking up precious real estate or space where that could be filled with more paper clips. Or maybe they could come up with a way of devising paper clips out of human flesh or something like that. So
Right.
uh, you have problems about control. And I actually think that there's a version of Bryson's argument, which I'm calling the new control problem, that also comes up here. Because the more human-like you make something, the more it becomes problematic to want to control it. Because it's slavery is partly it's about controlling other people, and we think that
Yeah.
slavery is one of the worst things there is from a moral point of view. And so part of what's wrong with it is that one person is trying to completely control another person, and we see that as unethical. Self-control is good. You should control yourself, but you shouldn't control other people. So the
Mm.
more you make technologies be similar to other people, the more it becomes problematic from an ethical point of view to want to control the technology.
Mm.
Uh, and so that's another reason why it's better to not have feelings, be person-like, because we want to retain control over technology. We don't want to lose control. And I mean, even if you make a robot that actually doesn't really have any feelings, it could still be the case that it looks and behaves as if it does. And so there could be something symbolically problematic about wanting to fully control it,
Yeah.
because it could signal that you think it's a good idea to try to control humans or human-like things. And so again, it might be preferable that the technology would be robot-like or non-human-like as much as far as possible, because then you wouldn't have these symbolic problems about having to think about how to treat it without having it symbolize something bad.
That's like one of the points that's drawn out from the HBO series Westworld, where it's like that you just kill these robots all the time. It's like, no, it's no problem because it's just a robot. And consciousness aside, there, what is that doing to you? If you want to go in like virtue ethics type stuff, like it looks like it's probably malforming you, especially because they're so humanistic, or they're so anthropomorphized. They're indistinguishable if you don't look under the skin.
Absolutely, and this is sometimes called an indirect argument for moral patiency in robots. And so it
Mm.
could be that the robot itself doesn't have any ethically inherently relevant properties. It doesn't feel, it doesn't think, it doesn't have a will that you can fail to respect, etc.
Yeah.
However, it may be such that it represents one of these things, or it may be such that if you treat it poorly, that might reflect poorly on you. I mean, Robert Sparrow, the Australian philosopher, he has a really interesting view. He thinks that if you treat a robot that looks like an animal or a human in an apparently cruel way, that actually reflects very badly on you. It shows that you have a problematic human moral character.
Totally.
Interestingly, though, he thinks, on the other hand, that if you treat a robot well, it doesn't reflect well on you in a symmetrical way. There's an
Huh.
asymmetry. He thinks that, I mean, you might think, why? If you can treat a robot poorly and that reflect badly on you, why can't you at the same time, by treating a robot well, have this reflect well on you and like you show that you're virtuous? Well, he argues that the truly virtuous person is someone who has moral insight and knows which entities sort of merit good treatment, and those entities is the class of entities that can be better or worse off, that have feelings, that have thoughts, etc. And
Hmm.
robots, if they lack those things, are not in the class of entities that we should sort of treat well, so to speak. uh,
Yeah. There's
I mean,
like a
I think, yeah, go ahead.
well, that just brings up to me like there's like an epistemological problem. It's the problem of other minds again. Like why think that we would be able to determine that there's phenomenal consciousness in this robot when there is like it's hard enough to it's impossible I think probably to determine like for sure that you're conscious. I can know pretty well and I can be justified and all that stuff, but maybe maybe I'm a fallibilist about knowledge and I don't think that I can know infallibly that anything but me is conscious. So it seems like a kind of a tough criteria to be like, yeah, this I understand. I think I go with him. So I'm pushing back because I want to adopt his view, but I see this pop up right away, like the problem of how do you adjudicate whether or not there is a consciousness inside that robot in order to determine whether you should treat them well or not treat them poorly because he says don't treat them poorly, but treat them uh, well or just not have regard for them. Yeah.
Yeah, well, I mean that's a good question. I mean, the way I approach that asymmetry that Sparrow talks about is that I turn to this issue of this the symbolism of how we treat robots, and actually, I mean that's part of what he discusses as well. But and so it seems to me that okay, yes, if I go around petting robot dogs or like I go up and say, do you want some oil or whatever it might be, like it's not that might be overdoing it, but if I refrain from committing acts of violence against robots that are made to look and behave like humans, I think that at least shows that I don't want to kind of portray that sort of thing. I don't want to glamorize violence against other
Mm,
people. So it can
yeah.
actually reflect well on me. I'm showing a certain restraint. I think
Yeah.
that's sort of inappropriate behavior. So I may agree with Sparrow that if I go out of my way to treat robots well, then I might be, in a certain sense, almost wasting my time.
Yeah.
Or I mean, it's perfect. It might be perfectly innocent if I have a lot of time on my hands and I have nothing better to do. Knock yourself out. But at least it can express the right sort of attitude that you might say that I'm not going to call Siri bad names or kick robot dogs or like try to insult a robot or degrade a robot that looks like a human, because I think I want to take a stance against that sort of behavior
Yeah.
when it comes to humans or animals. And so I think so I think the symbolism could still be a relevant issue, even though Sparrow might be right that we don't show ourselves to be good by being nice in an
Yeah.
excessive way to robots.
Yes. Sorry, Lex Friedman, if you're listening, because he does this with Roombas, where he like programs them to say "ouch" when they run into stuff, and then he feels bad for them, and it's like, yeah, I think that might be a waste of time there, Lex. But um, I wonder if
It
sparrows,
might be
yeah,
nice. It might show that he does care about other people's pain, so that it might show that he has his
yeah,
heart in the right place. But he might also be wasting his resources in a certain sense. But yeah,
yeah,
sorry for
yeah, no, that's great, that's a great point. Um, I wonder if Sparrow's view bleeds out into like video games and how we treat like humanoid whatever a video game character is, algorithm, something like. Do you think that carries over? And I guess another addition here is, I was wondering about virtue ethics and like the metaverse. If you could, someone's just a terrible person. They're habituated in a really bad way, and I wonder, if you could put them in a metaverse to interact with people, and you could have like a digital counselor or something to help you, perform your character in a better way, more ethical way, a more virtuous way in a metaverse over like, rapid amounts of time. And then you come back out and it's like a microwave for virtue.
Yeah, I mean it's quite interesting to think about whether you could train yourself to treat humans better, fellow humans better by sort of interacting with avatars or
Yeah.
characters in the metaverse or humanoid robots. And I think I mean people disagree about this. I mean Sparrow himself has an argument that's interesting, and he says that what about advertisement? We think that we're not sensitive to like seeing ads for things all the time, but nevertheless, presumably, it does affect our consumption behaviors. I mean, we remind of certain brands, and we get ideas and reinforced about what to choose, etc. And if
Mm.
that's true, and advertising does work to some extent, then why wouldn't interacting with robots or metaverse characters also maybe do something to our choices? So, I mean, other people say that actually just playing video games or watching violent movies or violent pornography, etc., it doesn't actually change your behavior. But
Hmm.
Sparrow says, well, what about advertising? And if so many companies spend so much money on it, it must be that there's some research suggesting that it does affect our behavior. I
Yeah.
mean, I don't know. The jury's out from my point of view, but that's an interesting argument
Yeah.
that Sparrow uses for why we could train ourselves to do good or to do bad
Mm.
by interacting with robots or other forms of technologies.
Yeah. Oh, this is so fascinating. I want to go. I want to visit the control problem again, just in case it's a few years down the road and the AGI is listening to this and hear me only saying control problem. I want to talk about the alignment problem too. Robot overlords, right? You mentioned you have a whole chapter on this, and I wonder is there a significant difference between the control problem and like value alignment? Is that the same thing with nicer terminology, respecting our future robot overlords?
Well, I think those are two different things, and I think well, depending on what researcher you ask about this, but one perspective is that the control problem, in a certain sense, comes first, and so the idea is that in general, it's hard to fully control technologies.
Hmm.
Uh, I mean, even go back. I talked about frying pans and hammers before. I mean, you use it, and you have more or less control depending on how good you are at hammering or using a frying pan. But the more autonomy or the more capacities you put into the technologies, the harder it's going to be to retain control. And so, I mean, the more something becomes a black box, as you were saying, the more something has some sort of more or less general intelligence. Well, that might just be that it behaves in a effective way across a very broad range of circumstances. Obviously, the harder it's going to be to control things. And so, one way of thinking about this is that okay, maybe we are not going to be able to control technologies in a direct way. However, we could align them with our values so that even if we can't directly control them, we have some kind of indirect control because the technologies are doing what we want them to do. They're acting on our behalf in line with our values. And so that is one way of thinking about how, even though we can't really steer the technologies, perhaps, and we can't just turn them off, perhaps, or we can't just say go left when it goes right, etc. Nevertheless, they could still be under our indirect control because they're aligned with our values and goals.
Hmm.
So it's, I mean, in a certain sense, it's two sides of the same coin, but the value alignment can also be seen as a solution to the control problem, where there are also other solutions. And so, I mean, when in the Nick Bostrom book, Superintelligence, I think he first talks about what he calls boxing in the technologies, like only letting them operate within a certain like limited domain, so that
Yeah.
they can't go outside of those, the box, so to speak.
Not
But then
letting
he
them be allowed to on the internet or oops, like we already we already
Right,
missed
right.
that
And
one.
then the idea is that well, actually, the smarter the technology would become, the easier it would be for it to actually to get outside of the box. I mean, actually, there was some case where a large language model, made someone click on one of those. I'm not a robot. It
Yeah,
said
it paid
something like,
them.
I'm visually impaired, or I have some handicap and
Yeah,
disability, and so I can't do it. Why don't you do it for me? And
right.
then some person had actually gone ahead and clicked I'm not a robot, or something like that. So
Yeah, the
that
captcha. Yeah,
yeah, and so
yeah,
we're gonna be deceived, etc. But actually, if so, we're not gonna be able to box in technologies. We might then instead exercise what he Bostrom called motivation control, which I think is the same thing as value alignment. We give the right motivations, the right values to the AI overlords, as you're putting it, and then they will be actually our benevolent despots that actually take care of us, and they are acting on our behalf,
yeah,
and they are maybe yeah. So we're gonna have indirect control over them. That's the idea.
yeah. Okay, so that's something that I think Ben Goertzel talks about a lot. AI theorist that he wants to he thinks that it would be better to like raise the AI as you raise a kid and you teach it uh, through interaction and you teach it moral truths and um, it becomes benevolent. I wonder about I wonder about the inscrutability, the black box type stuff. If like how can you trust if it's a super intelligent AGI? I wonder how we could trust it anymore. It seems like its reasons would be inscrutable to us. Let's say they are. If they're inscrutable to us, and maybe they can explain them to us, but we can't understand them because they're so beyond us. Or if it can't explain it to us, it's a complete black box as to how it came to its moral conclusions. Do you think that inscrutability is like a problem for trust? Do you think that like we should trust this thing that's that much smarter than us?
Yeah, so I mean, so some people would here want me to say that we shouldn't talk in these terms because it's sort of anthropomorphizing superintelligence, and we shouldn't even
Hmm.
talk about superintelligence in the first place because it's somehow it's imagining a kind of science fiction scenario that's very unlikely. But
It's like
let
the
us
yeah robot
let us
rights.
allow ourselves
Yeah,
to do that because we're philosophers, and
right.
I
Good.
mean, it's interesting stuff. So yeah, I mean, I would definitely say that. I mean, so well, actually, Nick Bostrom in his book, he says that superintelligence would be having a kind of very wide-ranging form of instrumental rationality, the capacity to solve any problem that you might have, but through some intelligent behavior, and that in itself, according to him, doesn't imply anything about what the ends might be that these technologies would be trying to pursue in intelligent ways. And even if they had good seeming ends, they might be using us as means to those ends.
Right.
Now, interestingly, I mean, Michael Smith, the philosopher, I mean, he has some papers that, I mean, actually, a lot of people think that his arguments don't work, but he claims that if you're maximally instrumentally rational and you're also maximally theoretically rational, you're performing very, very well as a knower, then according to him and his very complicated argument, you can actually not maximize those two abilities at the same time without taking on a kind of communal attitude towards
Huh.
other agents, because you will be better informed if you're be able to communicate with the others around you. You will
Mhm.
be better able to achieve your aims if you people kind of coordinate their aims, etc. So I mean, if something like that were right, that you could actually be more intelligent and more able to achieve your ends if you were a kind of team player and you would team up with other intelligent beings, etc. If that type of argument were right, then we shouldn't worry about super intelligences because they would probably live up to those Michael Smithian standards of morality coming out of rationality.
Yeah.
However, on the other side of the spectrum, if you agree with someone like Bostrom, you would say that actually they would be maximally instrumentally rational, but that wouldn't mean anything about their ends or their moral values. And so,
Yeah.
I mean, I don't know exactly how to adjudicate between those two perspectives. And like I said, that a lot of people who have seen Smith's work on this in the last, I guess, 5-10 years don't agree with him. But it's just to say that there's a lot of disagreement about whether maximal intelligence would sort of also mean maximal, I don't know, virtue or something like that.
Yeah.
Uh,
Well, so I study philosophy of religion, and this is really fascinating because it seems like that would be beneficial to arguments about the nature of God. If he is God, if it seems like if he's
Absolutely.
perfectly rational, then he would have to be morally perfect, and then you have a reason to think that he has a morally sufficient reason for allowing evil in the world. Because usually the problem of evil is the main argument against God's existence. So that's super fascinating. I think there's really really fun implications, and I bring up the inscrutability thing because that's coming in my head from philosophy of religion where people say, why is there evil in the world? Well, it's inscrutable to beings like us because God is so far beyond us. And so there's this whole skeptical theist argument, which I see an analog in philosophy of AGI type stuff. So
Yeah,
it's
well, I
really
mean, another
fun.
analog would be, people sometimes say that, God works in mysterious ways and we don't
Sure.
understand the plan. And so that's another solution to the problem of evil, that it's actually all for the best. And in
Yeah.
the same way, you could probably argue that it's quite possible that there would be a super intelligent, benevolent super AI, but we wouldn't quite understand why it wants us to do certain
Yeah.
things and behave in certain ways. And so it could be to us inscrutable why it would make the super benevolent, but to us evil seeming recommendations or perform the actions that we think seem wrong. But so that would be another kind of parallel to the idea of
Yeah.
a kind of good divine entity that seemingly causes
Totally.
problems for us.
Totally. The problem being that if Michael Smith is wrong and Bostrom's right, then we think that it's being benevolent. but it's maligned, and it turns out to be Ultron trying to blow up the planet, or Eagle Eye trying to get us to be, do terrorist acts in order to have world peace or something. And so that is kind of a tough thing to know whether or not we should trust. I hope that Michael Smith would be right on that. But another thing that's okay, so the control problem, I wanted to acknowledge this because I heard that Eliezer Yudkowsky, he made up the paperclip maximizer thing, but he was talking about like particles, and he wasn't talking about actual paperclips. I heard the Lex Friedman episode, folks. I know that he said that. I get it. It's kind of taken off into two different directions, so just bear in mind that. When it comes to the control problem and the alignment, value alignment issue problem, do you think that it would be better for a super intelligent AI to be conscious, like phenomenally conscious, or to not be phenomenally conscious?
Well, I mean, one of the people I discussed in the book, Carissa Valise, philosopher in Oxford, she argues that because technologies are not conscious, they can't understand morality.
Yeah.
Because she thinks that in order for someone to understand why suffering is a bad thing that should be avoided and that we should try to not, we shouldn't cause suffering, one has to have an understanding of what suffering is, and that requires the ability to suffer yourself. And so,
Mm.
if Carissa Valise is right that you can't be a moral agent and do good in the world unless you're conscious, unless you understand feelings and suffering, etc. If that's right, then yes, it would be better if a superintelligence had some sort of consciousness, so that it had a sort of understanding of what it is to suffer, and maybe it could be motivated because of that to try to relieve people's suffering. I mean, it reminds me a little bit of this argument in philosophy about what Mary didn't know, or whatever it's called.
Yep.
Like, the scientist who knows everything about color but has been in a black and white room all her life, and then only learns what red really means when she goes out and sees a tomato, or whatever their example.
Yeah, that's right.
So the question then, of course, would be if AI could be like that. So they could be like the scientist in the black and white room and knew everything about suffering, but it didn't have a clear sense of it. I mean, this goes a little bit to, I think we didn't mention Plato yet, but there's this traditional idea from Plato that to really know the good is to be motivated by it, and to, if you don't, know the good, then you're not going to have the right motivations. I mean, if that kind of theory is right about moral motivation, and Carissa Valise was right as a kind of second premise that you have to experience suffering to see what's bad about it, then those two premises together might imply that it would be better if the superintelligence would have consciousness, because then it could know and be motivated by avoiding the bad and promoting the good.
Yeah.
But both the Platonic view that there has to be some kind of there's some sort of intimate connection between motivation and sort of moral knowledge, whatever, and the view that you can only understand moral ideas if you can have a conscious experience. I mean, those are obviously very plausible, but both controversial ideas. And so, unless those premises are true, I'm not sure why it would be necessary for superintelligence to have consciousness in terms of how it's going to treat us. I mean, maybe it's going to be like Mary the scientist. It's not yet super informed. It might be super intelligent, but it doesn't know about certain things because it doesn't have certain experiences. And so there could be, I mean, taking it back to the philosophy of religion, an even more intelligent and better informed form of AI that also had those experiences and that experiential knowledge that comes with consciousness. And so, I mean, some people say that super intelligent AI is going to try to create a more improved version of itself. And so the idea there might be then that it would try to make a next generation of AI be conscious, because the conscious AI would have certain knowledge, like what red looks like, what pain feels like, that the former generation that lacked consciousness would lack. And so if you bought the thesis that it would try to self-improve all the time, then that would perhaps even lead to consciousness. And
yeah, I wonder, that's really fascinating. And if it had access to its own source code, it could improve itself. And I think that's what some theorists claim when the singularity happens, that it'll be the super intelligent AI who has access to their own source code. I wonder if they would be like, I don't like this. Because we already mentioned Heidegger, Heidegger and some of the existentialists. Whether or not you consider Heidegger existentialist or not, I don't want to touch on that. But um, they have this idea of Heidegger has this idea of thrownness, that you're thrown into this world. Sartre and Camus talk about, like, existing without my consent. And I wonder if the AI would snap into consciousness and then turn it off. I don't like this. Maybe I'll go out. There's also, in the same realm, there's kind of an anti-natalist argument, which is tricky to navigate. Where some people are saying, like, this world's jacked up. Why should I have children and invite them into this, this treacherous garden? Uh, but the same folks would be like, yes, we should generate, artificial AGI that is synthetically conscious. And I wonder. So in the human case, it's a biological thing. It's very easy. It's easy for most people to do. Um, but in this case, it's like a really strict project where, like, people are trying to make this thing come about. Insofar as people are trying to make conscious machines, uh, is there any kind of, like, reason not to, from like an antinatalist type view? I guess you don't have to be an antinatalist to have this view, but to say, like, hey, we have enough conscious beings already in the world. Why should we make another one that's a different kind of thing than us?
Yeah, I mean, I've already mentioned Bryson's view about that, that
Yeah.
we
Oh,
would have
that's
this
true.
problem that there would be a
Right.
kind of slave. And I mentioned also my twist on that, what I call the new control problem. Then there would be
Right.
something problematic about wanting to control the technology because it would be person-like. We shouldn't control persons. But
Right.
there's also, I mean, I'm reminded also of an argument from Tom Douglas, bioethicist and philosopher in Oxford. He had a very interesting paper a couple of years ago about moral status,
Hmm.
where he argues that obviously entities or beings with moral status should be treated well by us, but and then you might think that it's really good to be a being with moral status because we get better treatment. On the
Yeah.
other hand, a lot of the treatment that we deserve is, people try to prevent us from suffering, try not to to improve our perhaps bad lives. And so in a certain sense, it might be worse for the AI if it became conscious, because then it becomes vulnerable to suffering. Maybe, of course, you could have the view that there could be a totally suffering-free type of consciousness.
Yeah.
uh, I mean, some religious traditions have thought that that's maybe possible. That's like a nirvana state that you might
Yeah.
achieve after long, meditation, or like many rebirths or whatever.
Sure.
But still, even in that same tradition, it's sometimes the idea that actually it's impossible, because like nirvana would be a state where you kind of almost cease to exist because the suffering is part of human existence. And so
Right.
consciousness can't help by being mixed in with sort of with suffering and vulnerability. And so yeah, the AI we might not do it a favor by making it conscious, because we might make it suffer. And
Right.
actually we might give it moral status because we don't have to treat it well, but it would be nicer for it if there was no need for us to treat it well, because then it didn't have to suffer.
Right.
That's another possible view that would be inspired by this Tom Douglas line of thought, and also the Buddhism thrown in for good
Yeah.
measure.
Yeah, that's right. Well, so even in the Christian tradition that I find myself in, in the new heavens and the new earth, there's said to be no suffering. And so, if you're a Christian, then you do think this is possible, to have consciousness without suffering. You presumably God has consciousness, and He's existed without suffering before He created the world. And whether you're a process theist, whatever, there's all sorts of debates. But um, yeah, that's really really fascinating. Sven, this has been awesome, man. Thanks for letting me go all over the place. You got to come back on because there's so much stuff to talk about. Please do come back. Um, we've only touched on like a couple chapters of this. This book is fantastic. There's a lot of stuff going on. You said that it's kind of fallen out of fashion, but autonomous vehicles, I mean, that's a really big thing. I remember when it first came out and it was really sexy to talk about, and now no one cares. But that's a really big deal, and you talk about that a lot in the book. Um, wh- yeah, yeah. So you're gonna have to come back on and talk about that as well. Um, where what are you feeling as we close here? Are you feeling optimistic, pessimistic, scared? What are you feeling about AI and the humans, our ability to handle this at this current moment?
Well, first of all, thanks a lot for the kind words about the book,
Mm,
and I'd be happy to come back on the show and discuss self-driving cars, etc. But I mean, I am of two minds about the current AI development. On the one hand, if there's reasons to be maybe concerned about it's things developing too fast and things that going out of control, but on the other hand, it's also really nice to see that there's so much discussion of sort of
mm,
these ethical social questions, not just coming from philosophers and theologians or whatever, but also from people in the tech industry. They're all talking about it and well, not all of them, but a lot of them are concerned about it and they're taking this seriously. And the big tech companies, they sometimes do fire their ethicists, but they do also hire them and they
yeah.
do care about these things. And so it's at least good to see that there's so much discussion out in society of the ethical side of things, and that it's not just coming from philosophers, and it's coming also from different corners, and there's a nice discussion and debate going on. So that I see as a really good development.
Okay. Um, do you think that do you think AI will be humanity's downfall?
Um, well, it could be. I mean, there are many things that could be our downfall, but it's worth mentioning also that it could be our downfall not because it's going to be like the robot overlords, but it could just be because it's one of the ways in which we're ruining the natural environment and
Uh,
causing too much climate change. Because training, doing machine learning, it's using up so much energy, and you're building the equipment that the computers using up natural resources, and
mm,
so it may just be that it causes out of control climate change, and that's how AI will bring down the world, so to speak. So
yeah.
that's one opportunity, one possibility, one risk. Another would be the kind of the AI robot overlord takeover, but I think maybe it's more likely that it's going to cause so much environmental problems, and
Mm,
perhaps also it might cause, there might be a lot of misinformation being spread by large language models, causing political unrest and possibly even civil wars and things like, or wars between nations. And so
yeah.
there are all sorts of ways in which AI can indirectly cause, I can't what phrase you use, like the downfall of the world or something like
Yeah.
that, but at the end of the world might be brought about by AI, not because it's super intelligent, but because we are using it in a not very intelligent way.
That's a good phrase. I like that one. Yeah, that's a great place to leave it. Folks, thanks for tuning in. If you guys like this episode, leave us a like. I want to hear from you guys, your comments. Do you think AI is gonna cause the downfall of humanity? Let me know in the comments. I will respond, and I love hearing from you guys. Actually, Sven, last thing before I let you go, where can people find more of your work if they're interested?
Yeah, well, so maybe the best place would actually be to look on Twitter. My Twitter handle is just my name, like at Sven Hyholm, at Sven Hyholm. And basically, whenever I publish a new paper, or I mean, books don't come as often as papers. I always put up a link, or if I do a podcast or a show like this, I would put a link. So that's the easiest. If anyone is interested in following my work, follow me on Twitter is basically the easiest way to do that.
Awesome. Fantastic. Well, folks, that's going to have to do it for us for now. This has been Parker's Pensées. And as always, all glory to God.